From the year 1900 to modern day, global change and realignments accelerated. The invention of the train in 1804, the telegraphy radio in 1996, and the telephone in 1876 allowed for easier communication. Now, scientific innovations like genetically modified crops were able to spread, leading to the Green Revolution in the 1930s and 1960s, producing food for the world's growing population. Along with crops, medical innovations such as the polio vaccine in 1955 and antibiotics in 1928 increased the life expectancy of people. New forms of energy also developed, for example, nuclear energy and the use of oil. Economic productivity in countries like Russia increased and an increased dependency on oil developed. The power sources fueling machines and technologies resulted in more production of goods, therefore increased profits. With the expansion of the global population, the relationship between people and the environment changed. Dependency on coal and fossil fuels contributed to deforestation, desertification, and an increased use in the world's freshwater supply. Populations also began to compete over land and resources more intensely than before. The growing population increased the amount of pollutants and greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere. This escalated into the problem of global warming and the debate as to who had to sacrifice to get rid of the problem. Wealthy nations, such as the US and Europe, believed developing nations such as China, India, Russia, and Brazil should have to decrease their use of fossil fuels, while developing nations believed that the wealthy, developed nations should have to decrease their use of fossil fuels. Although medical innovations had decreased the effect and frequency of diseases and illnesses, diseases related to poverty persisted, such as malaria, tuberculosis, and chlorea. Also, new diseases emerged as a result of an increased lifespan, such as diabetes, heart disease, and Alzheimer's. In 1979, the UN adopted the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. The treaty outlined rights and protections of women, including the right to birth control. Effective forms of allowed birth control allowed women to have greater control of their fertility and altered sexual practices, leading to women being able to start small businesses and improve their education and economic status. Improved military technology, such as the 1916 tank used to go over rough terrain, 1914 airplanes, or the 1945 atomic bomb, along with new military tactics that were developed, for example the 1914 trench warfare and the 1942 firebombing, resulted in mass casualties. The developments led to higher levels of wartime casualties. In Japan, firebombing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki placed fear in other countries about the destructiveness of future nuclear weapons, and the massacre committed in Nanjing, China, in 1938 demonstrated the effects of improved military technology and new tactics.
At the start of the 20th century, Europe dominated most of the world, but over the course of the century, people and states challenged the order in ways that would redistribute power. Other people overturned the political order itself. The challenges to and attempts to maintain political order resulted in conflicts. Older land-based empires such as the Ottomans, Russian, or the Qing empires collapsed due to internal and external factors like political and social unrest or military failures. Colonies were also able to gain freedom through negotiation. An example of freedom through negotiation was India in 1947. India was able to negotiate through protests resulting from a rise in nationalism led by Gandhi, while some colonies gained independence through armed struggle and revolts like Algeria and Vietnam. New ideas of anti-imperialism contributed to the dissolving of empires and the restructuring of states. Nationalist leaders of political parties in Asia and Africa began to challenge imperial rule. People like Gandhi, who fought for India independence from Britain, or Francisco Franco, who led the fascist national movement in Spain. The Indian National Congress that formed to air grievances against British government, Ho Chi Minh, a Vietnamese communist revolutionary leader, or Kwame Nkrumah, who led Ghana to independence in 1956. Along with nationalist leaders and parties, religious, regional, and ethnic movements challenged colonial rule and imperial inherited boundaries. Movements such as the Quebecois separatist movement that began violently in the 1960s but in 1995 it was led peacefully when it failed referendum. The French-Canadian movement, which also meant to secure an independent state based on Quebec French-Canadian culture. The Igbo nationalist movement that aimed to recreate the Biafra state in Nigeria because of increased violence against them. Because the movement was accused of being violent by the government, although it was non-violent movement, or the Muslim League, that was a group that formed due to a want for Muslim majority state Pakistan. People like Muhammad al-Jinnah led certain movements. Different movements were also used to unite people across national borders, such as communism, which was used in China to reunite localities left by the fall of the Republic in 1960, and it was used by Russia as a way to unite the populace who were protesting the lack of food, land, and peace. Ideologies like Pan-Arabism, which was the ideal unity of all Arabian states, and Pan-Africanism, which was the ideal unity of all indigenous inhabitants of Africa, were also used. Movements to redistribute land and resources developed within states in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and sometimes advocated communism and socialism. For example, the Mexican Revolution started the redistribution process, and the Chinese Revolution promised the distribution of land and wealth to peasants while advocating communism. With political changes came major demographic and social consequences. Since old colonial boundaries were redrawn, populations had to resettle. For example, the India-Pakistan partition led to a large movement of Muslims and Hindus across South Asia, and thanks to the Balfour Declaration, the Zionist Jewish settlements of Palestine resulted in a major shift of Jews into that area. The division of the Middle East led to a grouping of conflicted people that could be blamed for modern-day social problems. The movement of former colonial subjects to former colonizing country or metropole maintained cultural and economic ties between the colony and the metropole even after the dissolution of the empire.
The increased number of conflicts led to the Holocaust during World War II and other forms of genocide. Examples include the genocide of Armenians in Turkey before and after World War I due to suspicions that their loyalty lied in other Christian governments and not in the Muslim monarchy, or in Cambodia in the late 1970s with the killing of civil servants in an effort to rid social classes for communism by the Khmer's People Revolutionary Party, and also in Rwanda in the 1990s, where the death of their president left a power vacuum in which the Hutu people filled, who later ordered the persecution of the Tutsi people and those related with them. Military conflicts began to rapidly increase on a global scale. The First and Second World Wars were total wars. Governments began to use the developed ideologies, including fascism, nationalism, and communism, to build war efforts, support, and to mobilize state resources through political speeches, art, media, and intensified forms of nationalism. States use resources like people from the home countries and colonies, an example of this being the Gurkha soldiers in India and the Anzac troops in Australia. The reasons for global conflicts in the first half of the century varied and included imperialist expansion by European powers and Japan, competition for resources, and the economic crisis brought by the Great Depression. Following World War II, the global balance in political power shifted partially away from Europe and developed into the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union became the superpowers, leading to ideological tension between capitalism and communism throughout the world. Consequences of the Cold War were the production of new military alliances, including NATO, the National Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Warsaw Pact, which is a friendship treaty in reaction to the creation of NATO. The Cold War also led to the promotion of proxy wars in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Even though conflict dominated most of the 20th century, many individuals and groups opposed this trend. Certain groups and individuals challenged the wars, like Picasso, who used art and painted the Guernica, or an anti-nuclear movement that occurred during the Cold War in an effort to prevent the use of nuclear weapons, or the Qing duck self-immolation. Some individuals promoted the practice of nonviolence in an effort to bring political change, like Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Nelson Mandela from South Africa. Protests and movements opposed and promoted alternatives to problems, such as the anti-apartheid movement against racism in South Africa. Participants in the global uprising in 1968 and the Tiananmen Square protests that promoted democracy in China. Militaries and militarized states responded in ways that intensified conflict, like the promotion of military dictatorship in Chile, Spain, and Uganda, and the increase in weapon trading and weapon complexes. While there were peaceful movements to get change in politics, there were violent movements against civilians to achieve political aims. Groups like the Real Irish Republican Army, which aimed to unite Ireland, also known as the ETA, and Al Qaeda were all groups that used violence against civilians to achieve political aims.
Ideologies like communism spread across the world, in particular Russia and China. In these governments, they were in control of the national economies and they controlled industrial development. In Russia, the shift towards communism was called the 5-Year Plan, and in China, it was called the Great Leap Forward. Both of these movements shared the aspects listed above, as well as the idea of commonwealth shown by land redistribution. Before World War I, the U.S. and many parts of Europe were more on the capitalist side, leaving their nation's markets as private industries. However, after World War I, they began to play a much larger role in the regulation of their economies to ensure that they didn't totally collapse and lead to total failure for their nation. This Great Depression was caused by failure to pay for reparations by multiple nations across the world and a major stock market crash in the U.S. Other nations, however, especially the new ones that came out of World War II, started off as having very economically involved governments as to promote their growth and development as a nation. One example of this is Nasser in Egypt, who regulated trade as to make sure that it steadily developed. However, by the end of the 20th century, most of these countries, including many of the new ones, turned back to more capitalist economies. This was because between the Green Revolution and other changes in economy, most of the nations around the world had overcome their respective Great Depressions by then, thus they didn't need heavy regulation anymore. To maintain world peace and prevent any more global wars, like the recent World War I and World War II, new global organizations were formed. One of these was called the United Nations, which now has 193 member countries, and it provides humanitarian aid to these member countries, including helping to cure disease and reduce illiteracy. Along with peace organizations, new trade organizations were made to organize the newly spread global free markets. One of the major ones is called the World Trade Organization, or WTO. Its purpose is to regulate international trade. It does this by setting rules of trade and by aiding in negotiations. Another one is the World Bank that helps countries by giving loans for projects. As technologies and economies grew and developed, they also began to pour more pollutants into the Earth's environments. This led to global movements and protests of this mass pollution, and they mainly focus on the pollution of drinking water, the oceans, and the atmosphere. As the world developed rapidly, so did people's ideas about equality based on race and gender, and law based on this as well. This led to global feminist movements, protests for education, and especially protests for equality. Some of the major equality marches included Gandhi's marches in India, African American and women's rights marches in America, and marches against apartheid in many South American countries. One other thing that spread during this period was popular and consumer culture. This included music styles like rock and major sports events like the World Cup and the Olympics.